Good afternoon and welcome to this policy dialogue on the EU's new trade strategy, open, sustainable and assertive, maybe with a question mark. We're very glad that we could jointly organize this between EPC and Egmont because, as you will know, this is a very timely discussion. We have just had the new trade strategy. I think there's a lot in there, many issues which are also controversial or challenging. Certainly the question of how trade can contribute to the transformations which we are facing, how trade sits within our global relations, how it sits with relationships with partners and competitors. Certainly question of how trade can deal also with the more difficult issues, the renewal of multilateralism and the impulses which might also come from across the Atlantic with the new administration, which certainly seems to take a very different view on international cooperation on trade. So there's a lot to discuss, and we're particularly glad to have Sabine Weyand, Director General for Trade from the European Commission, to introduce the discussion, and then we will have two reactions to that. We'll introduce them when we come to that. But just to say, we also want to make this as interactive as possible. There are a lot of people registered, so I'm already apologizing if we can't cover all of the questions, but you have the opportunity to put your question into the question and answer box, and I will try to pick out as many of those as we can when we come to that part of the event. Or alternatively, you can also raise your electronic hand and we will then come to you and unmute you if we are able to take that question. But without further ado, I'm very happy to have you back, Sabine. And I promise we will not be talking about Brexit this time, but I think there's a lot to talk about when it comes to the new trade strategy. So very grateful that you took the time to discuss it with us today.
Thank you very much, Fabian, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm very happy to be able to set out our brand new trade strategy. I wanted, by way of introduction, to talk briefly about the why, the how, and the what of this new trade strategy. So why did we launch this exercise? And believe me, while we were going through it, we asked ourselves that question again and again, or why did we start this? Because it's been very difficult to pull all the various things together. But we think it was necessary to do that. When we started discussing this in early 2020, the COVID crisis had really just hit us. And that brought to the fore two themes, which you will also find prominently in the trade strategy. One is the question of how to organize resilient supply chains, what is necessary for to address any potential vulnerabilities in supply chains. And the second is the digital challenge, because we all moved in lightning speed towards a digital world for which we were only partly prepared. But of course, the COVID crisis also exacerbated trends that we had seen before. The US-China conflict about technology, which in reality is about economic and ultimately political leadership. The crisis of multilateralism, with the emergence of China without sufficient convergence with the rules of the game, and the US administration, which then basically pulled the plug on the multilateral trading system and resorted more and more to unilateral measures. And of course, in the EU, we had also, in reaction to the climate change challenge, which had turned into a climate emergency, reviewed our EU growth strategy, which is built on the twin transitions, green and digital. And trade policy is the external projection of the EU's internal economic policy. So obviously, there was also a need to do an adjustment here. And when we looked at all these challenges, we realized that indeed the world was quite a different one from 2015 when we had last adopted a strategy, Trade for All. So there was really a need to look at a new consensus on trade policy, on the direction of EU trade policy that takes into account these external challenges, and that also provides a reply to the internal questioning about trade policy that we have seen emerging. So that is the why. Now, the how, given that the objective was to try and build a new consensus, we decided to go for a large public consultation with many events across the EU, with a lot of discussions, with elected representatives at EU level, at national level, civil society, etc. In the written consultation, we got more than 400 very substantive contributions. And what we realized is, or what this confirmed, is that trade policy is subject to very different expectations. And we have to navigate a course between these different expectations. I'm talking about trade policy as a means to tap into the growth potential of markets outside the EU, to provide opportunities for businesses, and to provide opportunities for job creation. And 35 million jobs in the EU directly depend on trade already. Those are, in general, the higher paying jobs, and that is an expectation that trade policy contributes to the economic recovery as well by creating these opportunities. The second is, of course, the support to the Green Deal as the key building block of the EU growth strategy, as I said. What is trade policy's contribution to addressing the climate emergency? But also, trade itself is changing. Trade in goods is the easy part, still highly relevant, but we see that there is more and more focus on services and, as I mentioned, on digital. And then thirdly, there is also the ambition to use trade policy as an instrument to effect change in third countries. And we have to navigate a course where we take these expectations into account in a realistic manner, while avoiding the trap of trade policy breaking down under the weight of too many different expectations. So with this, I come to the what of this new consensus. This is built on the three principles that you already mentioned by way of introduction, Fabian. Open, sustainable, assertive. That is, those are the principles underpinning this strategy. And the mindset behind it is one of open strategic autonomy. So you see, we really like the acronym OSA. Can stand for different things. But open strategic autonomy is a mindset which basically says the EU wants to be an actor in its own right and shape the world around us in line with our interests and values. In an interdependent world, we have to do this by working with others. So autonomy is not autarky. And the strategic choice of openness means that we will act multilaterally and in cooperation with others wherever we can, and we act autonomously wherever we must. This leads us to 6 priority areas. I will not go into all of them in detail now, because I would like to be able to respond to what the audience wants to raise, and I can imagine that there are different interests, and so I will leave the details to the discussion. But the 6 priority areas are, first of all, the reform of the WTO. And we have to have a fundamental reform across all functions of the WTO. Negotiation, we need to make sure that the WTO addresses the trade challenges of the 21st century. We have to enhance the monitoring function, transparency providing function of the WTO, and of course the dispute settlement after the previous US administration has killed the appellate body. And there is a very extensive annex on WTO reform annexed to this strategy, which shows that there is a pivot back to multilateralism. And that is justified by the fact that multilateralism and rules-based trade in general is in crisis, and we are at risk of falling back more and more on power-based trade relations, which is in the interest of nobody. Second priority area is the green transition and responsible supply chains. And that is where we are also looking at issues like core labor standards, where we are looking at the issue of forced labor. No doubt we will come back to that also in the discussions. Third priority area is digital and trade in services, where we also need to build up rules that are fit for the 21st century. Fourth priority is to build on the strength of the Brussels effect and to use our regulatory power, again, in cooperation with others. There is an economic rationale behind that, but there's also a values rationale behind it, because who is going to set the standards in new areas from artificial intelligence to digital trade to automated driving, whatever, if it's not a coalition of democracies that sets these rules, then I think we will see that more and more authoritarian regimes will try and influence the global rules of the future. Fifth point, we have a particular responsibility also vis-à-vis our neighborhood countries, South and East, and vis-à-vis Africa. So that is another focus area of our new strategy. And last but not least, implementation and enforcement, and leveling the playing field. As I said, we try to do that by negotiating rules multilateral, plurilaterally, bilaterally, but we also need to strengthen our autonomous rule book. That's why we are coming with an anti-coercion instrument that is part of our work program for this year. We are going to come with the legislation on foreign subsidies in the internal market. We will come with legislation on deforestation, and also with the due diligence legislation, which will have a specific focus, that work stream will have a specific focus on forced labor. And I think I will close here. I've given you the broad brush picture, and I'm very happy to go into more details depending on the interest of the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabine. I saw quite a bit of nodding from Marie-Pierre, Marie-Pierre Vedrenne, the Vice Chair of the Committee on International Trade in the EP. So would you say this strategy is going in the right direction? Where do you see maybe there should be a greater emphasis? What are the areas where you think the enforcement implementation side will matter particularly?
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you first for the invitation, and I'm very glad to be here and with Sabine and all of you to discuss the trade policy review. To answer for your question, let me say that I welcome this new European trade strategy, which includes many priorities I share and support. Especially welcome the clear commitment of the Commission to build our open strategic autonomy. This concept is key to ensure that Europe takes its destiny back into its own hands. And I completely agree that the EU must be at the front of defending a predictable and rule-based trade. And that must be coherent, like Fabian said, with our interests, our objective, and our values. And I think the name of this new trade strategy is quite interesting: open, sustainable, and assertive. Just few remarks. Open, of course, the EU is open and must continue to be, but without being naive. We cannot adopt protectionist measures because 1 out of 7 jobs in Europe depend on export. But we have to find a right balance between openness and fair competition. Our openness goes hand in hand with rule and trade defense. Sustainable. We need to ensure that our trade policy do not harm our objective as defined in the Green Deal. And our trade policy must contribute to promote high social level standards also. That means that our trade policies that benefit all people, business, and the planet. And in the context of our ambition in terms of climate policy, we need concrete tools to push our partner to follow our some objective and to fight against climate change. Assertive, and I think that is the most interesting in my point of view, because we need to ensure the protection of our interests, and we need to defend the rule-based trade. And the EU need new tools to make sure that the rules are respected by every trading partner. And trade relations are still to be characterized by a high level of tension. Sabine Weyand mentioned a lot of them. So we need to dispose autonomous measures and to enforce rules and ensure coherence with higher values. And it's why, for me, coherence is the key. To work also of our acceptability of our trade policy. Because if we are not be coherent, our public opinion don't accept our trade policy. So I will, like Sabine Weyand, I will not go into the detail for all the proposals, but highlight some of them. First, multilateralism. Of course, for me, it's very important to defend World Trade Organization and to work on the reform of World Trade Organization. Because if we succeed in to have a reform on World Trade Organization, we promote and we have a rule-based trade. Like mentioned, we have now the new Director General. For the first time, it's a woman, it's an African, and we have a lot of expectation on this issue. First, I think at this level, it's the involvement on China. We need, especially with our American ally, to engage China on level playing field, to ensure we are level playing field, especially on finding a common agenda to find against destructive subsidies, against counterfeiting, and forced technology transfer. So we need the current negotiation on subsidy industrial goods to set new instrument standard with the commitment, especially from China. Of course, we have also at this level a negotiation on the e-commerce, and the digital aspect is very, very important. And we know that the European Union is a key actor on this topic because we have also GDPR. So it's important to move on this subject. At the World Trade Organization, a second challenge is to make sure that trade contributes to the implementation and the concretization of NDSG. We need to work on this issue and to have an ambitious reform agenda on this topic, to work on combat climate change, environmental, social, and labor standards, because we want to succeed on this issue. And like mentioned by Sabine Weyand, another topic at the World Trade Organization is, of course, the appellate body dispute settlement. We need to work on this issue, and the European Union is a key actor. We have demonstrated that we have the possibility to have some allies on this topic, and we need to move forward on this. Another point for me is very important, it's enforcement. We need to work on this issue, not only because I was the rapporteur on information regulation, but I think it's very, very, very key. Because I think now concluding trade agreements is one thing, but ensuring the proper implementation is another. And if we don't succeed on this, it's not possible to convince our citizens, our enterprise, our agriculture that trade policy is a success. Of course, the Commission has already proposed, for example, the Chief Trade Enforcement Officer, and it's very positive. We have also the strong initiative access to markets. So I think it's very good initiative, especially in direction of our SMEs, because we know that SMEs is very important in our market. Another topic is the respect of our standards and mode of production when we spoke about enforcement. So we need to work on this issue because it's a question of conformity and traceability. And we know also that the EU is a key normative actor. So for us, it's very important to defend our rule, our standards. Third, I welcome here the Commission ambition to develop new instruments, because I think it's very important to strengthen our toolbox and to be more assertive. So of course we privately work on enforcement regulation, and now we have maybe a new proposal for a new instrument to defend and to act, to deter and to counteract coercive measures. And I think it's very important to have this proposal. I think it's a major shift of paradigm. So I'm very happy that we need this proposal, because all the time I have a question about my ambition of this topic. And I need to say that I think that protect our interest is very important, but protect our interest doesn't mean protectionism. So it's very important to have new tools and to defend our interest. And like mentioned by Sabine Weyand, we have also different instruments like due diligence. Of course, it's very, very important to work also on this topic. And now we have a lot of questions about forced labor, about the relation with China. So European citizens expected a lot from us, from the European Parliament, but also on the Commission side. So due diligence is also a very, very important topic. And the European Parliament will adopt next week in the plenary a report calling for bold legislation to ensure mandatory due diligence, inspired and based on French good example. And I think it's very important. I have one regret on this trade policy review. It's about our TSD chapter. Because I think when we discuss about coherency, about efficacy, I think it's very important to work on this issue. For example, the non-paper, French and Dutch non-paper, has proposed some good experiences, I think. We need to explore this possibility. But I know that some member of the council maybe have some question about this, but I think it's very important to work on this issue. And maybe another option is also to make the general dispute settlement mechanism competent on TSD provision. I think it's very important to work on this issue. Of course, we have now the decision of South Korea, of the panel of South Korea, but now it's very important to work on this issue, because a violation of TSD disposition should not be only ends of cooperation, of dialogue, because with some partner, we know that it's not enough to work on this issue. So to conclude, we know that at this moment we have also currently concluded bilateral agreements, and the European Parliament work on this, especially China and Mercosur. So I think it's why it's very important to work on enforceability and to work on strengthen our toolbox, to have the possibility at the European Parliament to maybe, I don't know, to give our content. So I think it's good timing to work on this issue. And like you said, this trade policy review, now we have many expectations. Because like I said in the introduction, for me, it's very good proposal, but now we need to deliver. So it's why it's very important that the trade policy is not only a slogan, but a reality.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will actually come back to Sabine just after Guillaume's intervention to have also a response to the areas where you see more need for emphasis. But we'll turn first to Guillaume van der Loo, who is research fellow at EPC and jointly at Egmont. Please, your remarks.
Many thanks, Fabian, and many thanks, Sabine and Marie-Pierre, for your comprehensive but snappy overview of the new trade strategy. Now, the strategy is obviously very comprehensive, putting quite a lot of objectives and proposals on the table. But I think for those of us who have been following EU trade policy closely, there are actually not a lot of big surprises. There were no new, unexpected priorities or legislative proposals announced. And the strategy essentially, brings back the many proposals and objectives that the current Commission has been cooking up over the last year under this strategic autonomy umbrella. So it's therefore quite challenging for me to pick my battles on this and to focus on a few issues. And therefore, I will do a bit the opposite, which is maybe a bit more sneaky, but I will try to identify a few important issues which were actually not really discussed in detail in this rather comprehensive strategy. Now, the first issue, which was a bit not ignored, but which was only covered in a limited way, is the EU's trade relations with Asia and Southeast Asia. And this is a bit surprising, as this region is, of course, the region where the largest economic growth will occur the next couple of years. And moreover, Asia and the Pacific were really in the previous Trade for All strategy, the priority area. And now this is not really covered and rather in detail. For example, the document hardly discusses the future of the EU's trade relations with the ASEAN countries and with the alphabet soup of regional trade agreements that are mushrooming there, from the RCEP and the CPTPP. For example, has the EU completely abandoned region-to-region bloc FTA with the ASEAN bloc, or will it continue only with its bilateral approach? How will the EU engage with the CPTPP and the RCEP now that China is also on board? These are fundamental questions which are not really covered in detail. Also, for example, on this issue, the previous Trade for All strategy envisaged an investment agreement with Taiwan. Again, this is not even mentioned in this document. I could maybe relate to the investment agreement with China. Another crucial partner in that area is India. Only a couple of weeks ago, the EU launched a trade and investment dialogue with India, which very carefully considers resuming these stalled talks on a trade and investment agreement. This will be a priority for the current Portuguese presidency, and there's the EU-India summit in May. But again, India is hardly mentioned in the document. Finally, on this point, also China is actually, not covered explicitly very much in detail. But obviously, indirectly, China is the subject of concern when talking about the WTO reform and subsidies and state-owned enterprises. And also, China obviously is targeted when discussing the enforcement and the EU's autonomous toolbox. Now, on this last issue, on the EU's autonomous trade measures, such as, which were already mentioned, the new enforcement regulation, the proposals on foreign subsidies, anti-coercion, due diligence, and so on and so forth. The link between the investment agreement with China, the CAI, and this autonomous toolbox will become very, very important. There are obvious concerns in the European Parliament and in the INTA committee about the link between the investment agreement with China and sustainable development and forced labor. We briefly touched upon this before. And the Commission, especially in the European Parliament, and I think we will come back on that later on. And you see that the Commission is aiming to reassure the European Parliament by stressing that the CAI and the ratification of CAI will go hand in hand with the deployment of these autonomous tools. And if you listened to the INTA committee last week, you could see and hear that several MEPs, I think also Marie-Pierre, were almost linking these autonomous tools with as a kind of a condition before ratification of the CAI. And of course, all these instruments, it will take time to have them in place. And moreover, I think a lot will depend on how actually the EU or the Commission will use them, because having them in place is one thing, but actually how it will be used by the Commission or, for example, the member states, if you look, for example, to investment screening, is another thing. Now, secondly, a second point, which was only covered surprisingly in only to a limited extent, were trade relations with the United States. But obviously this can be explained by the fact that the Commission has developed or published its new kind of a communication on EU-US relations in December, which covers quite in detail the priorities for EU-US trade relations, such as, WTO reform, trade and climate, digital issues, so all these areas of common interest. And since then, we finally had a bit of a sneak peek into the envisaged trade policies of the Biden administration. We had the hearing of the new USTR, the trade representative, last week in the Senate. And only yesterday, actually, the president's trade agenda in the US for 21 was adopted. And actually, if you look at this document, we see a lot of similarities between the US trade strategy and this new EU trade strategy. There's, again, also on the US side, a focus on trade as an instrument for economic recovery, trade and sustainable development, WTO reform. However, on both the USTR and this new trade strategy in Washington remain very vague on a few very important short-term priorities. For example, how and if and when will the Biden administration roll back some of the trade policies developed under the Trump administration? For example, the USTR was very vague on whether or not the US will now terminate the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminium. They were a bit more committed with regard to solving the Airbus Boeing dispute, but nevertheless, it's not that suddenly there is a window of opportunity and that everything is possible. You see that the new administration in Washington remains very prudent and carefully, and I think we will have to wait a couple of months before we really have more clear view. But I would also be I'm very keen to hear from Sabine, for example, if there were really new developments really the last couple of weeks on that front. And the final point that I just briefly wanted to mention, because I want to leave enough time for the debate, the final missing issue a bit in the strategy is actually, for me, investment. If you look at the Trade for All strategy, the previous strategy was a strategy on trade and investment. It really went hand in hand. And now investment as such is a bit missing in the current strategy. And the previous strategy obviously had a big focus on a new approach on investment, and really paved the way for a new investment court system, which reformed ISDS, and also at the multilateral level. So since then, a lot happened. We have now new investment agreements with this new investment court system, in CETA, with investment agreements with Vietnam, Singapore. We have an investment screening framework. So there are a lot of investment tools, but nevertheless, this strategy doesn't really give an overall view or policy on how these different investment instruments could interact and should be further developed or strengthened. And there are actually a few challenges, because the EU has now several investment agreements and a few investment court systems in place. However, none of these agreements are into force because they are mixed and they are not really popular for ratification in member states. And for example, if you just look at CETA, the story continues. Only today, there are again problems in the Irish Parliament, or in Ireland in any case, for the ratification of CETA. And this means that the investment court system in CETA, which doesn't follow the provision application, will just remain a paper tiger or an instrument on paper. At the multilateral level, the EU is pushing for an investment court system in UNCITRAL, but still it needs to convince quite a lot of countries on that proposal. There are issues related to the Energy Community Treaty. I will not go too much in detail, but a lot is going on, quite some challenges, and these were not really dealt with in the strategy. So I believe it with that, and I then return to you, Fabian, for maybe opening the floor for discussion or comments.
Thanks, Guillaume. I think I'll give Sabine a chance to also respond to some of those, adding a couple of things also from the questions which have been raised. In particular, there have been some questions around anti-coercion mechanism and export credits, whether you can elaborate a bit on that, and also to comment on that and how far that is compatible with WTO. I would also like to add a question on public acceptance. And I think this is one of the great challenges which we have seen over the last years, that the public is rather more critical of trade policy, of free trade. Will your strategy address this? Will it make people more reconciled with the trade policy? Or is there a danger that we overpromise and underdeliver? That we negotiate agreements such as Mercosur, such as the investment agreement with China, but then we cannot actually get them through the system because we don't have the support at home. Sabine.
Okay, thank you very much. I think listening to Guillaume, I thought it is maybe useful to recall what this document is supposed to be and what it is not supposed to be. And that is also where it is different from the 2015 Trade for All, which was basically a very elaborate to-do list, a list of concrete actions. And I think there were around 100. That is not the way we wanted to go. What we said this time was basically to say, okay, what do we expect the world to look like in 2030? What are the trends in the economy and in trade patterns? And what does that mean for the priorities for the remainder of this Commission's mandate? And then set out the broad thrust. And that explains, for instance, why we did not see a need to go over investment policy as such, because we have adjusted our policy. We are now continuing to roll that out. There is at this stage no reason to go back on any of the elements. We are indeed working on at UNCITRAL on the Multilateral Investment Court, but no reason to talk about that. Then, of course, and that is the usual reaction, everyone says, okay, a strategy has to prioritize. And then they come and say, but you're not mentioning this country and that region. We didn't want to have a strategy which says the 5 priorities are the US, Latin America, Asia, the Pacific, whatever, you know, and then you name all the regions of the world. That's not the point. This is about the EU setting out what are our objectives. And then we look at the alliances that we need, that we have, that we need to build in order to deliver on these objectives. So we are not defining trade policy in response to others' policy. We are looking at what do we think is needed, what corresponds to our interests and values, and then we build the alliances or use the alliances we have. If you go through the text, you will see from WTO to working on labor standards, to trade and technology, to digital, etc., it is peppered with references to the US, exactly reflecting the fact that there we have quite a large degree of convergence. So it's not having a US policy. This is a trade policy, and we deliver it by working with others. Relations with Asia. I mean, I'm frustrated when people come and say, but you have to position yourselves in relation to RCEP and CPTPP. We already have agreements in place with many of the countries in the region. So, I mean, it's not like we are coming late to the party. And these agreements set standards that others fail to meet. An RCEP agreement, Marie-Pierre can correct me, we would never be able to get that through our authorizing environment because it has nothing on sustainability. So that is not a model for us. We have developed the type of trade agreement that we think we can negotiate and that we get through our system. As I said, the time horizon is this mandate. And no, we do not believe that there is any chance of getting an EU-ASEAN region-to-region agreement within that time frame. There is a reason why we went for bilateral agreements, which we can link up if once ASEAN is ready for that. But the lowest common denominator of what is possible with ASEAN is not a relevant yardstick for what we are trying to achieve. There are references to India in the communication. The problem is, of course, that India is an extremely difficult partner. We first and foremost need them to work with us on WTO reform. Yeah. And that is heavy lifting, and we are trying to use this high-level dialogue to get that going. We are also looking at the bilateral relationship. For instance, after India cancelled the bilateral investment agreements, we are now looking at, are they up for an investment agreement with the EU, given that they have opted for a Make in India policy, which is very hostile to imports. And given that they've been erecting more and more trade barriers, we are looking at trying to build a relationship around investment. To be seen whether that works, but that is the challenge that is there. And on China, again, we don't need, like with the US, we had set out our policy in December. As regards China, our policy has been set out in a communication in 2019, and that remains applicable. And that communication of March 2019 already set out the investment agreement as one building block of the China strategy. And nobody has ever said that that would exhaust either the issues we have to deal with in terms of trade with China, or the other issues that we need to sort out from human rights to labor. So I think there's no point in repeating in each and every document all the strategies we have set out before and which are still very relevant. And I come to the last point, there's nothing new. No, there is a lot new, because what you see is the pivot to multilateralism. And in that pivot to multilateralism, you see a focus on sustainability that you haven't seen before. And this pivot to multilateralism reflects the fact that the challenges we have are quite different from 2015. We are no longer in the luxurious position to say, what's the next country with whom we are going to negotiate an agreement? We are in a situation where the rules, whether multilateral, plurilateral, or whatever, are being more and more called into question and replaced by power-based relationships. And that is why this strategy puts the focus on saving the multilateral system. Thank you. Sorry, last remark on Marie-Pierre. TSD chapter, don't regret, because we will take this year to really sort that one out. So we couldn't anticipate the conclusions of an exercise we still have to make. And this is super complicated, and we will have a lot of difficult discussions on that, because to get the balance right between what we do in order to make sure that trade supports our Green Deal and what are the measures we need to take there, and what is the best way to effect lasting change in third countries without coming across as colonial and prescriptive, that is a balance we still need to discuss. And there is a link between the substantive commitments you can have in an agreement and the enforcement mechanisms. So we need to take the time to have that discussion. We've anticipated the review of the 15-point action plan to this year. So we will continue the discussion on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll pick up a couple of the issues from the questions. At the end, I will also go back to Guillaume and Marie-Pierre, so you will have a chance to also come in. But just from the questions, there were a couple of questions on standards and what role standards will play. I think certainly from an EPC perspective, this is something we have very much highlighted, that standards are a very important tool of EU policy. But that the impression is that we have neglected this a bit in recent years, and that we have not capitalized as much on our position as we could have. So especially standards in the context of open strategic autonomy, I think that would be one of the blocks of questions. Another question is in terms of your pivot to multilateralism and sustainability at the same time. What if those two contradict each other? And in particular, what if there isn't progress on a carbon border adjustment mechanism? How do we deal with the interface between those two? And tacked on the end of that is maybe the question also about US policy and expectations from US policy. Certainly we have heard a much more positive narrative about climate and about what can be done, but how will that play out, do you think, in the trade arena? I'll leave it at those. They're quite substantive questions, so I'll come back to some of the other questions afterwards.
No, thank you very much. On standards and regulation, I think we have been resting perhaps a little bit too much on the laurels of the Brussels effect. We basically said we regulate for, you know, a continent and the rest will just have to follow, which has worked out surprisingly well. But what we are seeing now is that other players are taking up more and more space in international standard setting organizations. The Chinese have been very active in international organizations here. And what we are also seeing is this increasing confrontation between the US and China is leading to a partial decoupling in the area, in the trade and tech field. And that raises new challenges for us. And from that point of view, indeed, this issue of regulations plays a major role in the strategy vis-à-vis the US, which is the reason why we have suggested a Trade and Tech Council, where we look at exactly at these issues. We basically want, in this strategy, now the trade strategy, we are setting out how we want to enlarge the regulatory sphere by working in particular with our neighborhood countries who want to come closer to the EU single market. And one of the areas where we think that can be most easily achieved is indeed through regulatory cooperation with the eastern neighbors, the southern neighbors, and also with Africa. So if you look at the focus we propose on Africa is, first of all, we take their ambition for a continental free trade area seriously. We look at how we can basically contribute to offering them an alternative development model to Chinese investors by offering them investment agreements, not investment protection agreements, but investment agreements that look at investment facilitation, that look at investors' obligations, things that show that European companies can be better corporate citizens than perhaps companies from other parts of the world. And the standard setting issue is a major part in this respect. So at the same time, and that is perhaps not sufficiently explained in this strategy, because we are working in parallel on an industrial strategy in the Commission, is, I said that before, trade policy is the external projection of the internal market. And the Brussels effect has to a very large extent relied on the quality of regulation for the internal market. We need to make sure that we maintain a high quality regulation for the single market, which is innovation friendly, because there is more competition around. And the US coming on board for the green transition is excellent news. It will also put us under pressure, because once they decide that they go in full Monty in order to support the green transition, they will put the money for industrial policy, for financing research and development, for developing new technologies. And the EU needs to be able to hold its own in this respect. That is why, that is why also from a trade angle, it is very important what we are doing on these important projects of common European interest, whether that is semiconductors, we are working on that, or the already existing one on batteries. So from the standards angle, let's look at making sure that we have an internal market regulation that is fit for purpose, and that then we can project through our trade policy. Is there a contradiction between multilateralism and sustainability? No. The fight against climate change is a global public good, and it is something that globally everyone has committed to. And sustainability has been anchored in the WTO from its foundation. So we really need to look at making this operational. The WTO rules have never stood in the way of environmental legislation, as long as it is proportionate and justified and does not entail discriminatory discrimination between imported and domestically produced goods. And I think if we look at what we are trying to achieve, we are not looking at discrimination. We are looking at, for instance, with CBAM, at preserving the effectiveness of our climate policy. And all what we are doing internally can only work if we prevent carbon leakage. So we have committed to a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is WTO compatible. There are different ways of doing that. We are looking at different options. We are in the process of finalizing the impact assessment, and we will discuss with our partner countries. So I think a lot of this relies on these things being discussed and being done transparently, being monitored and explained in order to show that one chooses the method that is the least trade restrictive in order to achieve a public policy goal that is recognized as perfectly legitimate under the WTO. So from that point of view, I do not think that there is a contradiction between the WTO and sustainability. I think that the challenge lies in the delivery. And that is why we are looking at a multilateral statement on trade and sustainability, trade and climate for the next ministerial conference of the WTO. On the US policy, I think here again, it will be important to factor in what we know of the US approach. And that is unfortunately at this stage, very, very little. I think we know the broad policy direction, but so far we know very little details of what concrete actions the US administration wants to take. So that makes it a little bit challenging now as we are developing our tools to factor in how we can, for instance, link up our CBAM with equivalent measures that the US may want to take, as long as we do not know how they want to organize their own climate regime. Will they go for an emissions trading system? Will they go for taxation, etc.? These issues then have to be factored in. So here we have a lack of synchronization, I would say, of the policy cycle, given that we are so far more advanced in setting out the EU policy. But that is something we are very keen to discuss. Catherine Tai is confirmed today. We are very keen to reach out to her. We've had discussions already with other parts of the administration that are confirmed. But at this stage, I think it's still early days to see what exactly the policy measures are. We have flagged that we are open and interested in a close cooperation, also settling our disputes. But you know, it will take a little while until the US policy becomes clearer.
Thanks very much. I'll pick up a couple more questions, and then I'll also go back to Guillaume and Marie-Pierre, and I'll leave Sabine then the last word to pick up on those questions. Two questions firstly on distributional impact of trade, and that's linking a bit into also my question on public acceptance, and in particular in relation to the economic impact which is coming through with COVID. It can well be argued that what we are going to see is an even stronger winners and losers effect. That certain areas might be left behind in this race, that supply chains are reconfigured in a way which disadvantages certain parts of Europe. How do we deal with that, and what could that do to the public acceptance of new trade agreements and trade policy more generally? The second question is really a bit of a challenge also on is the EU really such an attractive partner anymore? In the question, it was raised because of Brexit, so I did mention it, but only once. But I would say more generally, I mean, if we're looking at a European Union which is struggling to emerge from COVID, where we have increasingly heavy state interference in our economies because of this impact, where we tend to have low growth, high debt rates, and what we have seen for a long time, a shrinking of Europe's weight in the global economy. Is Europe an attractive partner, and what does that mean in terms of our ability to also enforce our standards, our values through trade. But I'll give Guillaume and Marie-Pierre also the chance to add maybe a minute or two at the most, and then go back to Sabine. I'll start with Guillaume.
Maybe then I will take up my precious time to actually ask a question myself. And I see that a lot of participants have the same question, and we have two key persons involved in this, is this anti-coercion mechanism. I think this will be quite a unique instrument, and legal and non-legal birds among us are wondering how this could or would look like and how this could be WTO compatible. And it was the European Parliament, if I'm correct, that really pushed for this, and especially in the context of the enforcement regulation. And there is now an open consultation, I think. So yeah, I mean, just my question would be then for both of you, if you could say a few words on that.
Thanks, Guillaume. Marie-Pierre?
Maybe first to answer to Guillaume, because for me this new instrument is very important and very maybe it's a link with enforcement regulation, because with enforcement regulation we expect a lot, and the European Parliament proposed provisional measure, and now we need to have a new instrument, because I think it's very important, like mentioned in the introduction by Sabine Weyand, the context has completely changed, and our partner and third country, now we are in the world on confrontation. It's not because we have, for example, Biden in US, that we are going in the past, and the all multilateral and behavior of our partner is keen to defend multilateralism and keen to defend also our interests. And like you said, Fabian, now citizen, SME, agriculture, and all European citizens expect a lot. So it's why this new instrument is very important, to show that we defend really our interests. And we know that in our toolbox, we don't have enough instruments. So it's just the beginning. We have the consultation by the Commission about the stakeholder about this instrument. I have seen that the judicial basis is like enforcement regulation. So now I'm waiting for the proposal, but I think it's very important to have really an instrument which is very efficacious. Because sometimes I have the feeling that, okay, we have new instruments, but we are not able to use instruments. So I think it's very important to work on this. And maybe just to conclude about the feeling and about a lot of questions raised by the participants. And Fabian, you ask a lot of questions about the acceptability of our trade policy. I think that all people have a responsibility. Of course, European Commission, of course, European Parliament, but also our enterprise and all the stakeholders. And sometimes I have the feeling that we ask all the time the European Commission to defend our interests. And of course, it's very important, because the European Commission is defend global European interests. But sometimes I have the feeling that some member states are not completely brave. So we need to be all on the same side and all on the same direction. So it's why, for me, this trade policy review is very interesting, because with this policy, we have a principle, we have goal. We defend open markets. Of course, it's very important because we are completely interconnected. We defend the Green Deal with this policy, and we defend our interests. So I think, like said by Sabine Weyand, for me, it's very good to don't have all the continent, all the area, because it's not the strategy if we mention all our partner. We need to see where we want to go. So it's why I think that with this trade policy review, like we said, we see where we want to go. We want an open market, but we need also a sustainable, and we need to really defend our interest. And I think that it's very the expectation of for all our civil society. So it's why, like I said, I think now we need that. It's not enough to have this slogan. We need the reality of this slogan. So I think that for the reality of this slogan, the new instrument is very key.
Very good. Sabine, to give you a chance to answer to some of those.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Distributive impact on trade and the winners and losers. And then you say that we are becoming less attractive because of heavy state involvement in the economy. I would put these things together in a different manner. We have indeed the problem in the EU that trade policy is an EU competence, whereas most of the tools for dealing with the distributional impact are at member state level. However, with the recovery fund, the recovery program, and our new industrial policy and the public investments in the twin transitions, we have a chance of bringing these things together so that we create opportunities through our trade agreements, and at the same time, we equip ourselves to take up these challenges, that the skills agenda feeds into that as well. So I think actually we are currently, that there are opportunities in the crisis we are currently living and in the instruments that the EU has put in place in order to deal with these. And we need to use them. I'm not saying that this is going to be very easy, but I actually rather see an opportunity in the investments that we are currently making. At the same time, we also have to talk to our trading partners, because everyone is putting public money into the economy and investments, etc. We have to make sure that that is really going to support global public goods, like the green transition, dealing with the climate emergency, and is not simply creating overcapacities like we have seen China using subsidies. So we also have to have a discussion with our partners on subsidies. That is part of the multilateral agenda, but also of the trilateral one with the US and Japan. The EU is an attractive partner. I have no doubt about that, because I just need to see who wants to do agreements with us. We basically have to say, sorry, we should only start negotiations where we see a chance of finishing them on the basis we are able to get through Parliament and Council. So I cannot see a diminished attractiveness of the EU, not at all. It is upon us, through our internal policies, to maintain and develop that attractiveness. But for the time being, I am not too worried about that, because that's not, if you look at the EU from the outside, and speak to partners outside the EU, you can see that the EU model is still seen as a very attractive one, as one that combines market economies with social security and strong environmental policies. And I think that is actually quite an attractive model for many. I indeed failed to respond to the questions you raised already before, so I will catch up. On the anti-coercion instrument, what are we talking about? This is an instrument that we need in order to deal with a situation where a third country tries to coerce the EU or its member states to embrace a certain course of action, to either refrain from what we want to do or from pushing us to embrace their policies. And this in disrespect of our autonomy to act. A country that does that steps outside the framework of international law. And international law then allows you to exercise self-defense in this case. So we are not talking about a situation where a country says, what you are doing is not WTO compatible, we drag you in front of the dispute settlement. That's perfectly normal. Great, let's do that. But what happens if a country says, we don't like what you do here, and instead of pursuing that through the WTO, we take the law into our own hands? In that case, we cannot be constrained to say, well, in that case, we take you to the WTO, and 2 years later, we will be able to have a panel ruling. And at this stage, not even the guarantee of a final settlement of the dispute. So for these cases, we have to equip ourselves to say, okay, we must be able to respond to such coercive action by third countries. We could already do that now, by the way, but then we would have to go through a fully fledged legislative proposal based on Article 207. And that takes too much time. So that's why we want to put forward a framework regulation, and then we take the individual acts through comitology, details to be developed. But that is what we have in mind. And this is one of these instruments which you then hope you don't really have to apply, because the coercive, the deterrent effect is big enough to persuade countries around the world not to go down that road. But you need to be able and ready to deploy this, because otherwise, in a world where trade is increasingly weaponized for other purposes, you have to be able to defend your corner. On export credit, that is something which is a complicated issue, but one where we see the effects more and more of a lack of a level playing field. So we have the OECD arrangement on export credits, but China, for instance, is not subject to this. We have tried now for quite a while to negotiate in the International Working Group on Export Finance disciplines that also China would subscribe to no avail. So therefore, we really need to review our options to have an EU strategy for export credits, building upon what the member states have. I mean, they have their credit agencies, but it's exactly these national credit export credit agencies that tell us that they are suffering from the unlevel playing field. So we will start with a feasibility study to assess the potential for an EU export credit facility and an enhanced coordination of EU financial tools. So basically the idea would be to look at what can we do with EU level support for export credits as a complement to the national schemes, to strengthen the competitiveness of EU bidders for significant projects, and to better project EU influence around key priorities such as the Green Deal. And this also entails increased coordination of existing financial tools, EIB support, etc. So it's not something we can just, put out within the space of a couple of months. This will require a lot of consultation and discussion. And that's why we are starting with a feasibility study around which we will then organize consultations. And I hope that I have now answered the questions.
Thank you very much, and apologies for overrunning, but it was a fascinating discussion, so I didn't want to cut it short. But we are definitely out of time now. And as expected, I couldn't get to all of the questions. My apologies that I couldn't pick up everything. But I'm sure we will return to the question of trade policy and also some of the specific issues which were raised today. But in the meantime, just thank you very much to the audience for being part of that, for Guillaume and Marie-Pierre, and of course to Sabine for setting out the new strategy. And I hope we can welcome you all back very soon at the EPC or at a joint event with Egmont as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And the debate is to be continued. Bye.
Indeed.
Bye.
Yeah.